Welcome to the writer reads The Strays of Lunar One, Book 1, The Unwilling, Chapter 17, Cross Country Flight. Oliver led them into the hills, his soul singing at the scent of trees and grass and the ruffle of a fresh breeze through his fur. He wished he could stop to investigate the world, but he didn't dare. Behind them, an angry company with too much knowledge of shifters had landed. He didn't know if they'd traced him to Micah's farm or found their way through the Merrimwa pack, but he didn't want to stop to find out. Whatever Big Man was, he wasn't human, and Oliver was pretty sure he wasn't Were or Lupar. No, Big Man was something else. Oliver didn't know what, and right now he didn't want to find out. He glanced over at Lewis, relieved his friend wasn't arguing, and worried as to why. Emmy had kicked him bad, and he hadn't had time to grieve. Oliver ran, keeping an eye on the shadows and on the sky, his ears strained for the sound of a skimmer, a shuttle, or dogs on their trail. Who was to say Mika would have a choice? Ravel and X might have gone up against Xanil Blue, but that didn't make them the good guys. Working with mercs had taught him that. Working with mercs. It wasn't a place to which Oliver had ever planned to return. Then again, biting Lewis without his permission hadn't been something he'd planned on either. He pushed the pace until they topped a second rise of hills, and then he climbed until he found an outcrop that would let him look back the way they'd come. Lewis stayed beside him, following close on his heels as he wound his way through piles of boulders until he could leap onto the bald peak of the hill. Turning back, he raised his nose and scented the air, sifting the different smells with his nose and trying to find one that might designate a threat. Turning back, he raised his nose and scented the air, sifting the different smells and trying to find one that might designate a threat. Nothing immediately alerted his wolf, but there were plenty he did not know. Shifting from all fours to his hybrid two, he settled into a crouch and looked in the direction of Micah's farm. It wasn't too hard to pick out, and Oliver was glad to see they'd travelled further than he'd hoped. He noted the cluster of buildings behind which he'd changed, and the large block surrounded by a double-layered perimeter fence, then scanned the countryside for the cottage. The tangle of roads was unfamiliar, but he thought he could identify where their rental stood. Unable to see more, he looked for the town, finding it further south. Looking beyond it, his eyes caught the glint of metal in the dying sun. There were 3 shuttles standing on the port's landing pad, and he wondered if it was always that busy or if more of their hunters had arrived than just Ravelin. The stars knew he hoped those craft didn't all belong to Ravelin's crew. He shifted his attention back to Micah's farm, pleased to note the yard was empty and no vehicles stood where the cab had parked. Birds burst from the trees surrounding the space he'd marked as belonging to the cottage, and he froze. Beside him, Lewis raised his lips in a soft snarl. The roar that echoed over the evening landscape appeared to come in answer. It was accompanied by a voice that rolled through them like static from a storm. I will find you, Landstrom. Lewis bunted Oliver's side with his head, and the howl lurking in his throat turned into a growl. Lewis cringed, whining as he backed toward the narrow trail they'd followed onto the outcrop. The roar sounded again, and he whipped around to face it, shifting to all fours and standing braced as though caught in a gale. Lewis pawed at his thigh, whimpering, before giving a sharp yip and trotting away. Oliver growled once more, but softly, as he followed. Lewis was waiting for him at the bottom of the incline, in hybrid form. How much trouble are we in? He demanded, as Oliver shifted to match his form. They have a shifter and a sigh. I think we're out of range. Oliver tried to comfort him. We still heard him, Lewis said. What makes you think it doesn't work both ways? Because most sighs I know can broadcast much further than they can detect, Oliver replied. Let's go. He shifted back to all fours and glared at Lewis until the younger wolf had followed his example. As soon as the changeling had complied, Oliver broke into the ground-eating pace for which wolves were known, one they could sustain mile after mile. Thinking about what was behind them, Oliver decided that was a good thing. Their hunters had found the cottage and worked out they were gone. While he'd liked to think their ruse with the cab and the farm had worked, Oliver didn't want to bank on it. Unless the kid had vanished out of Ravelin's reach, the second the Psy got a hold of him, their escape route was blown. Oliver broke into a short sprint. If he'd been in human form, he'd have broken into a cold sweat as well. A something and a sigh, and one powerful enough to broadcast over that range. If Ravelin didn't already have the boy in custody, or Wendy, they soon would have, and Oliver had no illusions about the company staying within the bounds of sentient decency. They'd already told him captivity was the option if he ran, and after that roar, Oliver had no reason to doubt it. He kept up the pace, sprinting for short distances and then trotting while they caught their breath. When full night came, he didn't stop, relying instead on the full moon overhead and the ambient light that resulted to find his way. Lewis ran beside him, not complaining and not stopping, although he ran closer as the night drew on. When the moon sank before sunrise and the land descended into near night, Oliver slowed their pace. They say the darkest hour is before the dawn, he thought, shepherding Lewis into the cover of one of the grey-barked trees with their drooping branches. A sharp, clean scent rose around them and leaves crunched underfoot. Oliver hoped those leaves didn't hide anything poisonous as he shifted to hybrid form so he could pull himself into the lowest branches. Reluctantly, Lewis followed, and they both settled into separate crooks where the branches met the trunk. "What now?" Lewis asked, and Oliver heard the tiredness in his friend's voice. "Now?" he asked, taking his tablet out of his satchel and booting it up. "Now I try to get online and find out what we're running into." "And where we can run to once we get past it?" Lewis wanted to know. "Yes, and where we can run to once we get past it," Oliver confirmed, calling up a map for the local area. "Also, what we might need to avoid." "When do you think they'll start tracking us?" Lewis asked. "They're going to have to find our trail," Oliver told him. "If they don't get a hold of our driver, that's going to take them a while." But with a sigh, he didn't have to elaborate. Lewis's sigh told him the man understood. They lapsed into silence, and Oliver studied the map, then navigated carefully to a satellite view. Before he followed the link, he laid down several Guardian programs. Their alert gave him barely enough time to yank the battery and destroy the tablet's chip. "That good, huh?" Lewis asked as Oliver shifted the branches enough to see the sky. It had moved from black to grey, and the Alpha slid out of the tree. "Time to move," he ordered, returning to his animal form as Lewis groaned and dropped to the ground beside him. This time he did not alternate sprinting with trotting, just focused on setting a pace they could keep. The map had said there was a small settlement further to the north, and that they'd already passed the closest one. The satellite map. He sighed. He hadn't had time to see if the sat map matched the known settlements. He was willing to bet there were other dwellings between them and the next official town, but he hadn't had time to check. They were going to have to hope, and hope harder that any they came across weren't the kind to turn them in. He didn't like that strategy. Hope and luck were no kind of plan, and the rewards were substantial. The terrain became rougher, and he dropped out of a trot to a walk, navigating around the base of a cliff and along the edge of a small creek. Water bubbled over stones, and Oliver waded in. Not only did the cool liquid ease the heat in his pores, but it would help break their trail. Lewis splashed in after him, and they worked their way further into the hills. At the very worst, it would slow their pursuers, and in the meantime, the overgrown slopes and gullies would make them hard to see from the air, especially as air currents tended to be unpredictable over this kind of ground. Oliver found himself relaxing and shook the feeling away. They weren't out of the woods yet, either figuratively or literally. Not stopping, he followed the contours wrapping the bottom of the hill, looking for a way up. He needed to see where they were going, to have some kind of warning of trouble before they found it, and to find a place to sleep that was far away from the water and those that hunted the animals coming to drink. Oliver scanned the surrounding landscape. The cliffs he'd found mildly comforting he now found slightly oppressive, especially as they narrowed into a gorge, giving them no choice but to take the water and paddle across a deep pool. Oliver thought about turning back, but decided to press on, pushing aside warnings of undertows, cave monsters, and flash floods. By the time his claws found sand on the other side and he was able to walk up onto the shore, he was exhausted. Lewis staggered after him. They'd almost reached the grass lining the brief beach before they realized they'd left tracks. Oliver looked back and knew he couldn't let them remain. They stood in stark contrast to the surrounding sand and would be a dead giveaway, even from the air. With a heavy sigh, he shifted into his hybrid form and tore a branch off the nearest tree. Lewis followed him up onto the grass and then just stood, watching as he trekked back to the beach and brushed their trail from view. When Oliver turned back, Lewis was still standing, his feet braced apart, his head hanging. Hiding the branch under the overhang of another greybark, Oliver started up the slope beyond it, his feet dragging with fatigue. After a moment's hesitation, Lewis turned and walked after him. Oliver felt sorry for the man. This was definitely not in the handbook for helping a changeling adjust. It was also not something he'd done in far too many years, and as much as he'd wanted to reach a shelter with real beds and real blankets and a real shower, Oliver had to admit he needed rest more. And he was hungry. But that at least was something he could do something about, and it didn't involve hunting down some of the local wildlife. He was hoping to be back amid civilization long before that happened. In the meantime, he was grateful for Wendy's forethought. Glancing back, he saw Lewis struggling to keep up and felt a twinge of sympathy for the new were. Together they worked their way up the steep slope, moving further back from the cliffs edging the gorge and staying in the tree line. The sun rose to light the nearby treetops and send shadows spilling down from the ridge. In another hour it would be high enough to dispel the shadows, and Oliver wanted to be under cover before then. He stopped their climb just below the ridgeline, leading Lewis into the shade of another greybark. This time he cleared the leaves from the ground before him and settled himself on his haunches, shifting to human form and donning the shredded ship suit before pulling out the meal box he'd carried through the night. "We need to sleep," he said, and Lewis gave him a single nod. He didn't say a word as he shifted from wolf to man, muffling a cry of pain. It wasn't the tidiest shift Oliver had seen him do, but it was proficient, and Lewis's familiar features soon looked back at him as he dressed. Oliver pulled the meal box out of his satchel and set the timer. "Girl knows her business," he said, pulling the accompanying cutlery while he waited. The box gave a single chime and unsealed, and the aroma made his mouth water. Lewis shifted uneasily, his eyes switching between a blue tinged by amber and silver and its usual deep hue. "Alpha," Oliver remembered, and indicated the changeling's satchel. "You want some help?" Lewis shivered, fighting his wolf as a growl rumbled out of him. Oliver changed faster, setting his meal aside and covering the ground between them in a single bound. Before Lewis had time to do more than begin the shift, he had the smaller man by the neck. Careful of the satchel his friend still wore, Oliver slammed the man onto his back, pinning him with a snarl that rumbled loudly in the leaf-covered space. Lewis tensed beneath him, and Oliver squeezed, leaning into the younger ware's face and snarling again. "I will feed you," he growled, and Lewis's ears flicked forward as Oliver added, "and you will share." Lewis stilled, his eyes calculating the odds that Oliver meant what he said. "Let me help you," Oliver told him. "You're carrying your food in the satchel. I'll prepare it for you." He watched as Lewis and his wolf worked through the implications. "Submit," he snarled, and Lewis stilled. "Submit," came out as a bark, and the younger wolf went limp beneath him. "Now stay." Watching Lewis carefully, Oliver slowly released his grip, breathing a soft sigh of relief when the man stayed where he was. "I'm going to find your food," Oliver told him, and reached for the satchel. Lewis tensed, and Oliver snapped his head up, snaring the younger wolf's eyes with his own. "Trust me," he rumbled. "I am your alpha." So saying, he opened the satchel and withdrew the meal, letting Lewis see when he activated the box and pulled the cutlery from its compartment. "Think you can let me give this to you?" Oliver asked, and Lewis looked from the box to Oliver and back. He licked his lips and whined, and Oliver slowly stepped off him and crouched, letting Lewis roll upright. "Ready?" he asked, as the man came around to face him. He hefted the dish in his hand, making it clear he was ready to pass it over. "You need to sit," Oliver said, and Lewis reluctantly settled at the edge of the leaves. "Ready?" The man's eyes blazed, and he gave an impatient growl. The dish chimed, and the lid opened. Lewis started forward, stopping when Oliver raised his hand. "Wait," he commanded, and Lewis stilled. Before he could change his mind, Oliver passed him the box. "Try using your cutlery," he suggested. "It's hot." Lewis tried, but in the end his wolf and his hunger proved too much. With a flick of his hand, he threw the cutlery to one side and buried his muzzle in the bowl. Oliver pretended not to notice, moving away to collect his own meal and inspect it for insects. From behind him, he heard hurried munching as Lewis downed his meal like any wolf. Listening to it, Oliver vowed that next time he'd try to feed him earlier. He settled his back against the tree and forced himself not to do the same. The stars knew the temptation was there. He was halfway through his meal when Lewis lifted the bowl and began chasing gravy with his tongue. The sight made Oliver smile. The man was like any cub or adolescent he'd ever seen. Still, he'd spent enough time among humans that he'd found the sight uncomfortable. When Lewis had cleaned the box, he glanced at Oliver, flinching back when Oliver growled his denial. With a huff of disappointment, the changeling sat and watched the Alpha finish his meal, his eyes following the fork from the bowl to Oliver's mouth and back. Oliver might have found that amusing, except he knew the human behind the wolf, and Lewis was probably just as taken aback as he was. He finished his bowl and stowed it back in the satchel. "We leave no trace," he instructed. "Clean up." The werewolf blinked, and Oliver gestured toward the discarded food container in the satchel. "Put it away, then find your cutlery," he repeated firmly. "You know the drill." As he spoke, Oliver watched sentience return to Lewis's eyes. The man blinked, met his Alpha's gaze, and blushed. "Clean up, Lewis," Oliver said before the younger man could say anything. "We'll rest here." Lewis quietly did as he was told, Oliver watching as the man sought out the thrown cutlery and brought it back. The changeling stowed it in his satchel and then looked to Oliver. The gesture was so omega that it gave Oliver a jolt. The twitch of Lewis's ears and the shift of his eyes as he moved to survey their shelter was more beta, so Oliver relaxed. "You need to sleep," he said. "I'll keep watch." For a moment he thought Lewis was going to argue, and then the man glanced around them. "Your wolf form would be most comfortable," Oliver advised him, shucking out of his ruined ship suit and stowing it in the satchel on top of the empty food container. Lewis watched him as he shifted from hybrid to wolf, and then did the same. Oliver studied the coal black creature before him and flicked his ears forward. "Sleep," he ordered, and the command came out as a short howl. Lewis gave him a resentful look, then wandered over to the tree and curled up against it, tucking his nose under the tip of his tail. He peered up once to make sure Oliver was still standing guard, then closed his eyes and relaxed into sleep. Oliver waited until Lewis's breathing evened out, then shifted back to his hybrid form and climbed into the lower branches of the tree. When Lewis still did not stir, Oliver climbed higher, stopping once he reached a point that would allow him to look out on the world. If he'd had his tablet, he'd have used the time to find out how they were going to get off this rock. Instead, he spent the time scanning the countryside for signs of a settlement that wasn't on the map. To the south and east, he could just make out the regular shapes of buildings from the town they just left. It stood in a broad area of plain, and the lift of a shuttle helped him pinpoint the port. Oliver frowned, watching the shuttle rise, taking a path that would take it out of the atmosphere. Ravlin were leaving? Somehow, he doubted it, but he couldn't think of any other reason for that kind of shuttle to lift. Heavily built, with all the grace of a wounded shanty beast, it reminded Oliver of the dropships he'd gone to war in. If not Ravlin, then who? Somehow, he didn't think the angry captain would have sent for them. Hell, the man had probably already left orbit and headed on the next leg of his journey. He'd have no idea the trouble they dropped into, and he wouldn't care, just as long as the trail didn't lead back to him or his. Oliver watched the shuttle disappear into the stratosphere and then moved carefully around the tree, finding another gap to give him a view of the north. If it had been at night, he might have seen the glow of lights from the two towns north of where they'd started. He might also have seen the glow of other settlements in between. As it was, the daylit glare was bright enough to hurt his eyes, and it made the shadows between the trees seem darker than they really were. On the upside, that meant anyone looking into the shadows of the surrounding branches would have the devil's own time finding him and Lewis, but it also meant the same for him. His only chance was to notice the movement of anything travelling through the trees lining the gorge and cloaking the hills. He let his eyes drift, taking in the lazy spirals of a lone bird of prey, and the leisurely movement of a herd of large grazers moving between the trees. The movement of smaller creatures also drew his gaze, but none of them seemed panicked or startled. Oliver rested against the trunk of the tree, letting his eyes follow the contours of the surrounding hills and drift over the sharp edge of the gorge. The side of the hill away from the gorge dropped steeply into a broad based valley that twisted and turned like the folds of a rumpled blanket, and nowhere did he see the blocky shapes of human habitation. He stayed until the sun stood high and fatigue began to make his head spin. Huh, better climb down before I fall down, he thought, and turned to begin his careful descent. Nothing moved in the landscape below. The animals had sought shelter as the day had grown hotter, and there was very little air traffic. Once, Oliver spotted a small flyer moving in a straight line that might have led it to the northern settlement he'd seen on the map. As he started the climb down, he saw another, higher up. It was heading south, and he paused to watch it pass. The boom of a ship re entering the system caught his attention, and he pulled himself in close to the tree, twisting his head to put the trunk at his back and brace against the branches above and below. That boom had been too loud for just one ship. He scanned the horizon and the sky, slowly moving his focus from the distant to the close. If it hadn't been for the sun reflecting off a pilot's canopy, he might have missed the flight entirely. They'd come in from the west and dropped fast. Oliver saw them as specks, then as intermittent shimmers as they came in close to the treetops and flew close enough to the ground to have to go around the hills. Every now and then their flight was obscured by a fold in the terrain or a dip in the hills, and then they'd reappear again. Oliver did his best to follow their flight path, and then started to worry they were searching the ground. The trees shook and the leaves rustled as something large climbed through the branches below him, and he shifted to see what it was. "Do you know what I thought when you weren't there?" Lewis demanded, pulling himself up on a branch beside him. Oliver hushed him and pointed toward the flight. Lewis squinted in the direction he indicated, a puzzled look forming on his face. When he finally caught sight of the approaching ships, he edged around the tree trunk, looking for a better vantage point. "That's a supply fleet," he observed as they came into view, making a path down the valley and holding a tight formation as they followed its twists and turns. "Must be heading for the base." "I didn't see one," Oliver told him, and Lewis shrugged, indicating the landscape. "Well, you wouldn't, would you? You'd have to follow their flight path to find it." "And what if they don't want visitors?" Oliver demanded. "Easy enough to figure out from the layout. We don't have to let them know we're nearby until we know they're not likely to shoot us first." "The way those guys fly?" Oliver asked. "What are the chances?" Lewis snorted. "You had any sleep yet? Because you're grouchy." Oliver laid his ears back at this hint of insubordination, and Lewis ducked his head. "No offense, boss, but you need to catch some Z's or you won't be in any condition to alpha." Oliver glared at him, then shot one more glance in the direction the jets had flown. It didn't help that Lewis had a point. "You eat me while I'm sleeping, and I'm not going to be very impressed with you." "And I thought I made such a good wolf," Lewis snarked back. "Yeah, well, we don't eat our own." "That's not what Amy's people say." "Who are you going to believe?" Oliver challenged, and Lewis looked away. When he looked back, all traces of humour and sarcasm were gone. "Get some sleep, boss. I'll wake you at—" He gave Oliver an inquiring glance. "Moonrise," Oliver told him shortly. "I saw nothing on our back trail. We'll split the night into 3 shifts and camp until morning. If they don't look friendly, we'll talk about our options then."